Good afternoon, everybody. What's happening? What's going on? What's going on? Peace and power be to all you beautiful people out there. It's your girl Tiffany coming through here live in effect. And I want to thank everybody that has been subscribing. Shout out to the new subscribers of my channel. Thank you guys for sharing my video, etc. So today I was very motivated to do this topic. And what got me doing this topic is because I actually got into the clubhouse the other night. And there were some brothers and sisters from West Africa or West African descent. You know, that's where our ancestors came from Central West African region. Okay. They was in there having a conversation. They were Muslims. And they was talking about the criticism and the antagonism they had received from those from other parts of Africa, particularly from North Africa and East Africa, right? From other Muslim brothers and sisters. So I was in the chat and I looked at the comment. Someone put in the comment section that the Arabs did not enslave you. Why don't you have the same energy towards the European like you do with the Arabs? And I started to want to say something, but I said, no, I don't want to get into no conflict because things was already heated in that room. Okay, it was heated in the chat. So I didn't want to get into no conflict, but I started to want to say something. Because a lot of us don't know about the Trans-Sahara slave trade. Now, we have heard about the transatlantic slave trade, but not the Trans-Saharan slave trade, right? Which happened prior to the transatlantic. This is when the Arabs, okay, took in slaves and sent them on the northern part of Africa and sold them off to the Middle East and to India. But see, a lot of people don't know about their history. So I think we're going to talk about the transatlantic slave trade. We also got to talk about the Trans-Saharan slave trade as well. Now, I spoke a little bit about it when I did the videos pertaining to Islam. I talk about the Guanago people and all of that stuff, right? Just like the transatlantic slave trade has took a toll over the African descended people, the Saharan slave trade did the same thing as well. It had brought by impacts to those in Central West Africa. And many can argue that there were those in the region that was in a higher position or that had certain institutions that played their part in both the transatlantic and trans-Saharan slave trade, that played a part as far as selling people over to foreigners just so they could be sold over to other parts of the world. All right, so we really have to get into these conversations because it's very deep. It's very deep, and you may wonder, well, what they got to do with us? Well, because we come from a descent of those that was in the sub-Saharan African region. We come from those descendants of the people. So that's our other descendants that we didn't know about that was sent off to the Middle East and India before the transatlantic. So we have to get into that conversation. Nobody likes to talk about slavery. Nobody likes to get into that discussion, of course. But it happened. It happened within the continent and outside the continent. It took place. So the conversation needs to be had. It cannot go under the world. We cannot just focus on the good part of history and think that's just the totality of it, because we'll be living in a fantasy and we'll be lying to ourselves. Now, is it a difficult conversation to have? Absolutely. It's difficult. It's a very hard pill to swallow. It's hard to talk about these things. It's really hard. But we want to know about our history and our people and origin, where they come from, etc. We gotta have these conversations. We got to have the conversation. We got to put it on the table. All right. So, with that being said, let me go ahead and get started. Now, for those of you that may not know, you can find this information on Wikipedia. And also, I got the articles and some books that you guys can check out as well. Now, let's go into this. During the Trans-Saharan slave trade, slaves were transported across the Sahara Desert. Most were moved from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa to be sold to the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilization. A small percentage went the other direction. Estimates of the total number of black slaves moved from sub-Saharan Africa to the Muslim world range from 11 to 17 million, and the Trans-Saharan trade routes conveyed a significant number of this total, with one estimate tally around 7.2 million slaves crossing the Sahara from the mid-7th century until the 20th century. Now check this out. Now let's go into the earliest part of it. So it talks about the earliest part of this, the Trans-Saharan slave trade. So records of slave trading and transportation in the Sahara dates back as far as the 3rd millennium BC, during the reign of the Egyptian king Seneferu, who crossed the 4th cataract of the Nile into what is today modern Sudan to capture slaves and send them north. These raids for prisoners of war who subsequently became slaves were a regular occurrence in the ancient Nile Valley and Africa. During times of conquest and after winning battles, the ancient Nubians were taken as slaves by the ancient Egyptians. And then it goes down to say the Garamantes relied heavily on slave labor from sub-Saharan Africa. They used slaves in their own community to construct and maintain underground irrigation systems known to Berbers as Fogara. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus recorded in the 5th century BC that the Garamades enslaved cave-dwelling Ethiopians known as the Trogodate, chasing them with chariots. In the early Roman Empire, the city of Lepsius established a slave market to buy and sell slaves from the Bantu African interior. In the 5th century AD, Roman Carthage was trading in black slaves brought from the Sahara. The empire imposed custom tax on the trade of slaves. Black slaves seem to have been valued as household slaves for their exotic appearance. Some historians argue that the scale of slave trade in this period may have been higher than medieval times due to the high demand for slaves in the Roman Empire. However, the slave trade through the Sahara in antiquity may have been small and rare, as Saharan trade didn't reach large dimension until the Arabs and Berber introduced large numbers of camels into the desert. All right, so now, and then going down here, it talks about the Trans-Saharan slave trade in the Middle Ages. Again, this is before the transatlantic slave trade even took place. Okay? Now, right here it says, Paul Lovejoy estimates that around 6 million black slaves were transported across the Sahara between years 650 AD and 1500 AD. The Trans-Saharan slave trade established in antiquity continued during the Middle Ages. Following the early 8th century conquest of North Africa, Arabs, Berber, and other ethnic groups ventured into sub-Saharan Africa, first along the Nile Valley towards Nubia, and also across the Sahara towards West Africa. They were interested in the Trans-Saharan trade, especially in slaves, as there was a constant demand for slaves in the Eastern Arab nation, and Constantinople, the Muslim slave traders distinguished themselves from the peoples on the other side of the Sahara. Referred to these African population as Zanj or Sudan, meaning black. Arabs would routinely acquire slaves through violent raiding, following by capturing them and sending them on dangerous forced marches across the Sahara to slave markets where they would be treated as chattel, as personal property that can be bought and sold. In North Africa, the main slave markets were in Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli, and Cairo. Sales were held in public places such as souk. So now, when you go down, let me just skip down here for a little bit. It says passage through the Sahara required the expertise of ethnic groups whose lifestyles were uniquely adapted for survival in scorching environments, namely the local Berber tribes and the foreign Bedouins from Arabia. For example, the Tariq and others who are indigenous to Libya facilitated, taxed, and partly organized the trade from the south along the Trans-Sahara trade routes. These various nomadic people were also critical as the guides, and camel drivers who aided the trade caravans, and resultantly, they were granted autonomy and treated as allies by governments of North Africa. Oases were vital way stations for caravans, and those such as Owajila, Gadames, and Kufrua in Libya allowed both north, south, and east-west travel. Even with the experts' help, the passage could still prove deadly to merchants and slaves. Sometimes whole caravans of thousands of people could disappear without a trace. All right, now you following this? So again, you can find information on here. I'm gonna have to just skip all of this. So right here, let's go down to where it says late Trans-Saharan slave trade, right? In Central Africa during the 16th and 17th century, slave traders continued to raid the region as part of the expansion of the Sahara and Nile River slave routes. It estimated that in the 17th and 18th century, 1.4 million slaves were compelled to make the trek through the Sahara. Captives were enslaved and shipped to the Mediterranean coast, Europe, Arabia, the Western Hemisphere, or to the slave ports and factories along the West and North Africa coast, or south along the Ubangi and Congo rivers. And then what it says, 1.2 million slaves are estimated to have been sent through the Sahara in the 19th century. In the 1830s, a period when slave trade flourished, the Gamades were handling 2,500 slaves a year. Even though the slave trade was officially abolished in Tripoli in 1853, in practice it continued until 1890s. One witness to the behavior of the slave dealers, G.F. Lyon, described their behavior in Libya thusly. None of the owners were ever without their whips, which were in constant use. No slave dares to be ill or unable to walk. But when the poor sufferer dies, the master suspects there had been something wrong inside and regrets not having liberally applied the usual remedy of burning the belly with a hot rod iron. With the red hot iron, thus reconciling to themselves their cruel treatment of these unfortunate creatures. And it sounds very similar, right? Sound very similar to how they did with the transatlantic slave trade, right? But it was more crucial. All right, so, and then we go right here. What says the Muslim historian Ahmad ibn Khalid al-Nasari bemoaned the unlimited enslavement of blacks in the 19th century North Africa, where men trafficked them like beasts or worse, and where the majority of slaves were Muslim who should have been exempt from slavery because of their religious status. All right, so it talks about the abolition after the establishment of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society in 1839 to fight slave trading in the Mediterranean. Ibn the first Ahmad the first Ibn Mustafa Bey of Tunis agreed to outlaw exploiting, importing, and selling slaves in 1842, and he made slavery illegal in 1846. In 1848, France outlawed slavery in Algeria. Slavery was not abolished in. Ooh, hold on. Whoa, wait a minute. Wait a minute, yo. Whoa, wait a minute. Check this out. Slavery was not abolished in Mauritania until 1981. Slavery was not abolished in Mauritania until 1981. 1981. We talk about chattel slavery. It was not abolished in Mauritania until 1981. They kept it going until the 80s. So it ain't been that long ago since the people got out of slavery. It has not been that long ago. And I want to give greetings to everybody in the chat before I continue. Shout out to everybody in the chat. Peace to everyone. It has not been that long ago. These folks just got out of slavery in Mauritania. That's what, over 41 years ago? Imagine what type of trauma they go through. And then check this out. It says slavery in the post-Gaddafi Libya. Now check this. It says since the United Nations backed and NATO-led overthrow of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi regime in 2011, Libya has been plagued by disorder, and migrants with little cash and no papers have become vulnerable. Libya is a major exit point for African migrants heading to Europe. The International Organization for Migration published a report in April 2017 showing that many of the migrants from West Africa heading to Europe are sold as slaves after being detained by people smugglers or militia groups. Do I need to go there again? Let me read that again. The International Organization for Migration published a report in April of 2017 showing that many of the migrants from West Africa heading to Europe are sold as slaves after being detained by people smugglers or militia groups. And then it goes on to say African countries south of Libya were targeted for slave trading and transferred to Libyan slave markets instead. According to the victims, the price is higher for migrants with skills like painting and tilting. Slaves are often ransomed to their families, and in the meantime, until ransom can be tortured, forced to work, sometimes to death, and eventually executed or left to starve if they can't pay for too long. Women are often raped and used as sex slaves and sold to brothels. And for those of you that don't know what brothels is, that's a whole house. All right, so they were sold to brothels and private Libyan clients. Many child migrants also suffer from abuse and child rape in Libya. And we're talking about people coming up out of West Africa. These are folks that came up out of West African region, sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to say something. Now, let me tell y'all a little story. At once upon a time, did you know that a male Muslim, I think it was Arab Muslims, yeah, the male Arab Muslims, right, for their birthday, when they reach around the ages 12 or 13, guess what they get for their birthday gift? Guess what they receive for a birthday gift? A slave. For a birthday gift, they receive a slave. Imagine that. See, this is the stuff that we don't hear about. This is stuff that we don't talk about. And I wish I could have said something to somebody in the clubhouse that made this statement that the Arabs did not enslave those from West Africa. They did. They did enslave. As a matter of fact, their slavery was 3 times worse than the transatlantic slave trade. It was 3 times worse. So what you're looking at is trauma on top of trauma. Okay? But we also got to look at those who played their parts in there. We got to look at those who was running institution and that was trading these people off to these foreigners. That's what we got to look at. See, this is what we have to really be unfiltered about things. We have to be unfiltered. So what am I saying? Should there be some blame taking place? Absolutely. There's some blame. There's some accountability that got to be taking place. Not just with the Arabs, not with just the European, but those Africans that was involved in it as well. There got to be some accountability. Because the reason why they got involved, either because they wanted the resources, either was because of political reasons, either because those individuals that they traded on were prisoners of war, or because of the customs they were practicing. Because someone used spirituality as part of the institution. Like people like to argue about Abrahamic religion, right? Being used as a way to indoctrinate and control and do evil things. Well, you had some Africans that use African spiritual systems as a way to bring about justification of slavery. But we got to be honest about that. They did. There were those who did. Not saying everybody played a part in that was into the spiritual system, but there are those who did it. And then there were those who were coerced into selling the people to foreigners. There were those who were coerced to do it. There were those who were forced against their own will. There were those who was put in a situation where they had no choice but to really play their part to, get their hands dirty. When we look at the story about Queen Zingo, right? Queen Zingo was born during the time when the Portuguese was going to places like Angola and the Congo, when they were taking over, when the slave trade was taking place. She was born into it. She had no choice but to play that part in it because she was the next in line. So when it was passed on down to her, she had to play that part and to selling the slaves. Now, maybe she didn't want to do it. Maybe she did want to do it. Who knows? But she was put in that predicament because it was a very crucial time. See, if we're going to deal with this, we really got to be unfiltered. We cannot sugarcoat anything. This is unfiltered. But let's continue. All right, so here, as you can see, there's the rise. According to Professor Ibrahim Baba Kake, There were four main slavery routes to North Africa, from the east to the west of Africa, from the Maghreb to the Sudan, from Tripolitania to central Sudan, and from Egypt to Middle East. The caravan trail set up in the 9th century went past the oasis of the Sahara. Travel was difficult and uncomfortable for reasons of climate and distance. Since Romans' time, long convoys had transported slaves as well as all sorts of products to be used for barter. And you can see it says town and ports involved. North Africa, Tangier, Morocco, Marrakech, Morocco, Algiers, which is in Algeria, Tripoli, which is Libya, Cairo in Egypt, Aswan in Egypt, West Africa, Mauritania, Timbuktu, Mali, Gao, Balma or Bilma, Kano in Nigeria, and just to name a few. And you can find information down here at the bottom of the page where it says references. You can go down here and you can look up more information for yourself. Okay? So, now also, you can also go to this website here. This website is another good one. It is called Slavery and Remembrance Organization, or .org, which is basically mean organization. So Slavery and Remembrance, Sahara Desert, right? What does it say? By the 8th century, the African continent was crisscrossed by the trade routes, many of them pathways for the movement of local and international commerce and enslaved people. African traders linked routes from the west coast to distant communities of the Nile and the Red Sea. Traders also established routes from the Saharan desert in the north with the savanna and forest region to the south. European traders and settlers were to benefit from these links when they began to trade on the coast in the 15th century, acquiring goods and people who were captured from the interior and brought to the Atlantic coast via the African traders' inland trading system. Now check this out right here. What it says: the best known of these ancient trade routes were those crossing the Sahara. For centuries, caravans of Arabs and Berber traders transported African captives from sub-Saharan Africa, trekking along a series of endogenoous stages to the slave markets of North Africa, the Mediterranean, Asia, and Europe. From the 8th century, demand for African slaves were accentuated by the spread of Islam. The vast networks of trade routes controlled by Muslims were used to capture people and transport African captives far from their homelands. Islam penetrated even further south, deep into West Africa, along the East African coast, and far into the African interior. It says, thus, its trader forged new trading links, providing goods from Europe and the East, which Africans exchanged for export, including slaves. See, this is the proof right here in the pudding. North African Muslims created networks of trade which span a vast area of sub-Saharan Africa. African societies were ensnared by the foreign slavers on the trading routes and forcibly marched in camel caravans across the Saharan desert, often in numerous distance to markets in the north. The Trans-Saharan routes were broken into small sections, with goods and people bartered and sold multiple times to new traders en route. The end result was that African captives were transported from deep in the continent to the edge of the Mediterranean, and even onward to Europe to the empires of Eastern Mediterranean. Berber and Arab trading routes created noticeable African ethnic groups in many major towns around the Mediterranean, from Cairo to Istanbul. And again, you can find this. This is a good website, slaveryandremembrance.org. You go on this website, you can find out information about the transatlantic slave trade, and you can find out information about the Trans-Saharan slave trade, okay? You can find this stuff. And I hope the brothers and sisters of Islam don't get offended by that information. But that's just the history. That's the history of what happened, what was taking place. So the Arabs was using Islam as a way to bring about justification of slavery. Now, Dr. John Henry Clark once said that when he was giving criticism about Farrakhan, he said, Farrakhan don't realize that he belonged to revolutionary Islam. East Africa represented radical Islam. West Africa was more a revolutionary Islam. So, meaning that those who was practicing Islam in West Africa, they was revolutionizing it rather than doing it just for radical purpose. They was intertwining it with their African custom, their spiritual system. So when you look at our history and you see that 15 to 30% of our ancestors were Muslims. So there's a high possibility chance that you got somebody that was Muslim down the line. Somebody who, especially if they were Fulani, if they were Hausa. 9 times out of 10, you got somebody in your descendant that was Muslim. You got somebody that was a descendant that was Muslim, and you don't know. Especially if they were Hausa and Fulani and Mandinka, chances are they was Muslim. But let's continue on. All right, so here's another article here. This one's called Slavery and Abolition, a journal of slave and post-slave studies. Salt, Saharans, and Trans-Saharan slave trade, 19th century developments. All right, so this goes into furthermore about the Trans-Saharan slave trade, talk about salt, etc. Again, you know, natural resources. Some people was being traded off for natural resources. Let's go down. Let's see what we can find in this article. So let's go down to the first paragraph first. All right, so it says the slave trade across the Western Sahara began in the medieval era, an outgrowth of the politics and economics of the people living along and to the south of the Mauritanian desert edge. Like the better-known gold trade, it too was soon linked to the evolution of an extensive inter-regional network based on the principal resource of the Sahara itself, namely salt. All right. So as early as the 10th century, Trans-Saharan trade centered on the exportation of salt to ancient Ghana and gold to North Africa over the next 2 centuries. These goods also included Sudanese slaves. Now let's go further now. It says the salt of Ye Moors was being brought from the at Dar by caravans, sometimes consisting of thousands of camels. A few years later, these Moors were apparently taking all the gold and cloth of the upper Senegal in exchange for their salt. Presumably, slaves continued to feature in this commerce. By the mid 18th century, powerful Saharians reportedly traded Ijal salt from the Tushit to the Niger market of Zingo in exchange for slaves and gold. All right, Richard Roberts was told by informants in Zingo that Moors were the biggest purchasers of slaves in the region during the era of the slave-producing Zingo Bambara state. And it goes on to say, in brief, the salt-slave relationship was one of the great antiquity, and it was firmly rooted in the desert-side exchange network controlled by Saharans. These merchants were mostly Moors or Hassaniya speakers, but also included Tamamashi speakers like the Tuareg in the Niger Bend. In the 19th century, both the commercial significance of the relationships and the centrality of these Saharians to its functioning continued, but more information supplied by curious European travelers and ambitious French colonialists allow us to see more clearly how this evolved and to what extent Trans-Saharan and interregional interests became integrated in the process. All right, so as you can see, this is titled Slavery and Abolition, a Journal of Slave and Post-Slave Studies. And salt was one of the reasons for the slave trade taking place within the continent. Okay? So, there you go. All right, so here's another article. Now, this article goes into the genetics. Check this out. The Trans-Sahara slave trade, clues from interpolation analysis and high resolution characterization of mitochondrial DNA lineages. Now, this comes from BMC, Evolutionary Biology. And this paper came out in 2010. Okay? So, you got Nordan Harish, Maria de Costa, Veronica Fernandez, Mustafa Kandel, Joanna B. Pereira, Nuno M. Saliva, Luisa Pereira. Okay, these are the people that contribute to the article. All right, so it goes into the background. Now let's look into a little bit about the background. It says the recent high resolution mtDNA studies are offering the possibility of shedding light on ancient and recent human migration events, allowing to inferring more precisely about the geographical origins of lineage observed nowadays in a certain region. In fact, the characterization of the full mtDNA sequence is being used to investigate local events as the Chaditic expansion from East Africa towards Chad Basin in the last 8,000 years, or historic movements as the diaspora of Jews, which could not be approached in previous more limited mtDNA survey. It says this approach is being applied to the long enduring discussion about the prehistoric migration across the Mediterranean Sea, leading to exchange of lineages between Iberia and Maghreb. Recently, the sub-characterization of H lineages observed in several northern African populations revealed its affiliation with Iberian expanding lineages after the last glacial maximum, being the same observed in Tuareg living in the Sahel. The Near Eastern contribution to the pool of H lineages in North Africa was minimal, indicating that a prehistoric European lineage input occurred in elevated frequency, enriching the ancient Near Eastern background of North African population, mainly constituted by the low frequent haplogroup U6 and M1. Now, that's a little bit about the background. Let's go down here. Now, it talks about the methods of what they did, etc. So, they said they took blood sample where collection from 81. Well, I'm gonna go back to the background, but let's just go down here to where the method is. It says sample and DNA extraction. Blood samples were collected from 81 unrelated people from Al Jadia, Morocco, nearly 100 kilometers south of Casablanca. Appropriate informed consent was obtained from all individuals, and total DNA was extracted from blood using a standard Chilet's 100 protocol. All right. Then it goes on to talk about the result and discussion. So it says the characterization of HBR1 and HBR2 diversity in the 81 individuals from El Chadia led to the identification of the haplotypes reported in Table 1. The HBR1 mtDNA diversity observed was in general as high as observed in other North African population, and the Foo's else values for the neutrality test were significantly negative in according with population, and especially itself notoriously for the Liberian or Libyan Touaregs reported by. Then it goes down to talk about when analyzing the proportion of sub-Saharan and West Eurasian mtDNA haplogroups in El Chadia population, the characteristic mixed pool was observed with frequency of 30.86% and 69.14% respectively. The sub-Saharan pool presented the branches L1, L2, and L3 in the following frequency: 24%, 28%, and 48% of sub-Saharan pool. The basal haplogroup L0 was absent. In the West Eurasian pool, the haplogroup said to have been introduced into North and East Africa as a result of a back to Africa migration from the Near East. U6 and M1 were observed with frequency of 2.47% and 6.17% in Al Chadia or Al Jadia, excuse me. Clearly, the main component of the West Eurasian lineages was made of possible Iberian spanning lineages following the post-glacial climate improvements. All right, so then goes on to talk about sub-Saharan haplogroups across North Africa. Check this out. So based on a database summing up 4,908 African and 2,178 Near Eastern and Arabian Peninsula individuals, 2A's show sample location indicated in additional file 1. We assay interpolation analysis of L haplogroups frequency as can be seen in figure 2B. The north to the south increase of frequency across North Africa and the Sahara is visible. In the east of the African continent, the highest L frequency are attained in more south latitudes than in the west and in the rest of the continent due to the presence of M and some N lineages, especially high in Ethiopia. So this alone, it just showed you proof of what event was taking place. So here goes the figure, right? Figure 1, routes for Trans-Saharan slave trade. So it shows you the routes that was taking place, all the routes that was happening. Okay? These were the routes. Let me go ahead and zoom it up. As you can see, when you look at the map showing location of the population sample used in this work and interpolation map for L lineages in those samples B. Okay. All right, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on this, but just to really show you that you can look up the information about genetics. See, this is why genetic is very important, because genetic tells historical information. It gives historical accounts of the events that were taking place as far as the people are concerned. All right. So genetic is nothing without history, and history is nothing without genetic. You cannot have history without science, and you can't have science without history, because it tells the story. So when you deal with the genetic and you look at the lineage, the haplogroups or whatever, it's very telling of what's happening. It explains why there is the admixtures. It explains why that some groups may have higher of DNA of other ethnic groups than others. It explains all that, so you start to really connect the dots. Like same with us. When we study about our genetics, right, and we study that majority of us got Central West African DNA. Well, how did that come about? How did we end up with Central West African DNA? Because of the events of slavery taking place. That's how we end up with those genetics. And we have a very high component of those bloodline, those haplogroups. And we got some admixture of European and some Native Americans and others. Because eventually our ancestors were either raped by certain individuals, had relationship with these individuals, etc. Or we have somebody in our family that was biracial, or whatever the case may be. All right, so you gotta study. When you study history, you also gotta bring in science, because science can help better explain history, and history can back up science. Science help better explain history. History can back up science. Okay, so that's this article. Right now, there's the book that you guys need to look into as well. All right, so this book is called Race and Slavery in the Middle East: Histories of Trans-Saharan Trans-Saharan Africans in the century Egypt, Sudan, and the Ottoman Mediterranean. Oh, excuse me, my bad. Let me go back. Yeah, so this one is called The Race and Slavery in Middle East: Histories of Trans-Saharan Africans in the 19th Century, Egypt, Sudan, and Ottoman Mediterranean, by Terence Walsh and Kenneth M. Cano. And there's another book is called Race and Slavery in the Middle East: An Historical Inquiry by Bernard Lewis. All right. So as you can see, that's chapter 1, and it starts talking about slavery. Let's go over here. Then you got chapter 2, dealing with race. Chapter 3, dealing with Islam in Arabia, prejudice and piety, literature and law. And chapter 5 is conquest and enslavement, ventures in ethnology, the discovery of Africa in black and white, slaves and arms, the 19th century and after, abolition, equality in marriage, image and stereotype, myth and reality. Right, and the title of this book is called Race and Slavery in Middle East. let's go into this chapter. So this was copyrighted in 2010. So the contents: the introduction, the study of slavery in the 19th century Egypt, Sudan, and Ottoman Mediterranean. Okay, it says Muhammad Ali First Army, the experiment in building an entirely slave army. Then chapter 2 deals with Sudanese, Habasha, Takarna, and Barabira, the Trans-Saharan Africans in Cairo, as shown in the 1848 census. African slave in 19th century, rural Egypt, a preliminary assessment. My ninth master was a European, enslaved blacks in European household in Egypt. All right, from 1798 to 1848. Then goes down to Magic Theft and Arison, the life and death of an enslaved African woman in Ottoman Ismet, slavery and social life in 19th century, Turco-Egyptian Khartoum, enslaved and emancipated African on Crete, black and kinless and hungry, manumitted female slaves in Kidal, Egypt. And the ninth chapter goes into slaves or sibling. Abdullah al-Nadim's dialogues about the family. All right, so that's this book. And then here's a book called The Trans-Sahara Slave Trade by John Wright. Okay. Zoom that up. All right, so go over here to the content, right? It says slaves and slavery in the Sahara. You got the introduction. The second is Sahara grazing, war, and trade. The third one is a medieval Saharan slave trade, the lands, ways, and the seaways, faith and abolition. Chapter 6, the slave trade through Marzouk. Chapter 7, the slave trade through Gamades and Got. Chapter 8, the Wadi Road. Chapter 9, the slave trade between Sahara and Mediterranean. Chapter 10 is the Mediterranean Middle Passage. Chapter 11 deals with Morocco, the last great slave market. Chapter 12, the delusion of abolition. And chapter 13 deals with the conclusion. All right, so now these are the list of books that you can look into. The Trans-Sahara Slave Trade by John Wright. Race and Slavery in the Middle East, Historical Inquiry by Bernard Lewis. Race in the Middle East, Histories of Trans-Saharan African in the 19th Century, Egypt, Sudan, and the Ottoman Mediterranean, edited by Terrence Walsh and Kenneth M. Cano. All right, so I'm going to show these books one more time. All right, so that's all for today. Okay, that's all the information, and you guys can go and look those books up on Amazon, or you can go to your local bookstore and check them out. You can find them on eBay. Okay, and you can also go to what's that website called? Let me type it in the comment section. Yeah, so you go to this website called Books, ABE Books. All right, so you can find a lot of information regarding to the Trans-Sahara slave trades out there. You just got to do the research. You got to look it up for yourself. Okay, so the only thing I'm here to do is present sources, and if you guys want to look into those sources, you are more than welcome to do so. So if you got a project to do, any type of assignments that you need to do, or if you just doing some type of what you call those reading groups, the reader groups or whatever y'all want to call it. If you guys got some type of book club, that's what it's called. Yeah, if you got a book club going on and you need some good books to read up on, especially dealing with this subject matter, you can check it out here on my video, and you can look it up, and you can also check out all my other video contents on here as well, if you need more information. But until next time, you guys be safe and take it easy on yourself. And thank you guys so much for those of you that was tuning in. Again, shout out to the chat. I want to thank everybody in the chat that was watching this video as well. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, like my channel, share my channel, etc. And check out all the other video contents that I have on here. Until next time, y'all be safe. Peace and power and elevation be to all of you. And this is Tiffany, and I'm out. Peace. All right.